first and foremost, thank you for your stamina and making it to the last session on the last day, and for selecting me of your other wonderful choices. I'm delighted to be with you here this evening. And today we're going to explore a very particular category of Bordeaux wines. I know some of you may have been in either Paul Saint-Aimion's session or his other Bordeaux session that was in this room just prior to mine. He and I spoke, we're good friends. I don't think there's going to be too much overlap in terms of the content. And of course, you'll have 6 different wonderful wines to taste today. So what we're going to, only 6. I figured I'd give your livers, a break, so then you can enjoy and indulge and perhaps overindulge this evening at dinner and the after party. But what we're really going to talk about today is really going to be a little bit of a history lesson. I know for some people, the Cru Bourgeois category is a bit of a mystery. Maybe some people thought they were coming to Cru Beaujolais, which it's not. So it's really going to be a history lesson. Tom Wallman has graciously loaned me his laptop. My laptop is a little bit too new and doesn't have the appropriate connection for the LCD projector. So some of the colors have changed. I apologize, but I think everything should still be legible. But why I called this topic Cru Bourgeois a category whose time has come is specifically because there's been a lot of history with the category. We're going to cover that. We're going to go back in time and then come back to the future. I promise we'll get to tasting the wines much sooner than it takes us to get to the future in that respect. But yes, I hate when we have to wait to the very end to get to tasting, so we won't do that. But I think that it's important to see where this category came from, as well as where it's gone, where it is today, and hopefully we'll have time for a little bit of a discussion about what you think about these wines, as well as the category as a whole. They've asked me to kind of stay behind the podium, so I usually am a little more free, but I'm a little bit tethered this afternoon. So just for a little bit of context, for those of you who are a little less familiar with Bordeaux, Southwest France, very specifically right here alongside the Atlantic Ocean. For further context, it is the largest quality wine producing region within France, and you can just get a sense of just the volume compared to other regions that you may be familiar with. So certainly there's a lot of wine being produced in Bordeaux, all at the AOC, or the Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée level, so the quality level of wine. And of course that leads to lots and lots of wine on the shelf, some of which is familiar and some of which can be a mystery. But specifically today we'll talk about the Cru Bourgeois category, and we are going to hopefully demystify that for you today. So why is there so much wonderful wine coming out of Bordeaux? Well, it's a perfect confluence of a number of different factors. I'm not going to spend too much time on terroir, but just again, for those of you who may be less familiar with Bordeaux in general, I just do want to point out it is a maritime climate. We have, of course, as I already mentioned, the Atlantic Ocean, the Gironde estuary, the 2 rivers, the Dordogne and the Garonne. And so these are important moderating influences, keeping the temperature not too hot, not too cold throughout the year. Similarly, we have excellent soil. So there's a limestone bedrock, which runs underneath the entire Bordeaux region. And then we have a lot of gravel, particularly gravel that is brought from the Pyrenees by the rivers, by the Garonne River, as it makes its way into the Gironde estuary. So again, climate coming into contact with excellent soil, providing good drainage, as well as some reflective properties for getting to full ripeness. And equally important is the fact that not only are these rivers important for the climate, but they're also navigable rivers. Bordeaux itself is a port city, very easily accessible to trade routes. And in fact, as you may recall, Bordeaux was previously under the rule of England, and this was an excellent way to get all this wonderful wine up to England, and that's why there's that relationship between Bordeaux and Bordeaux wines and England that still exists today. And the reason this is so important for this particular category is that because of this port city, there was a lot of trade, and you had a lot of commerce going on. More specifically, when we talk about the Middle Ages, and of course, none of us were around quite back then, but of course, we had the rise of this word, the bourg, and from which we derived the word bourgeois. So this rise of a merchant class, so not only aristocracy, not only peasants, but now we had these merchants who had their own money and could actually go out and buy land. So this is very different from what had been in more rural areas, or even just in this area before there was the creation of a city with a port and trade. And so these properties became known as the crus of the bourg. So the French word cru is growth, and we know that also from Grand Cru Classé, another classification. So because of this, we had these properties being so named. And so the Cru Bourgeois properties date significantly far back and really date as far back as the rest of the Bordeaux wine trade. So this is not a brand new category that was just created by some marketing team in an office somewhere. This is a very historical category that has roots very deep within Bordeaux. In 1740, we have the first document listing all of the Médoc wines and included a lot of the Cru Bourgeois properties, even again, as far back as that time. So a lot of the properties that are maybe more well-known, more well-vaunted today, did include also these Cru Bourgeois properties. So, first glass of wine. Told you I wouldn't make you wait too long. So what we're going to be tasting today, and you have a tasting sheet, is the Chateau Bornac, but we're going to taste 6 wines from different communes within the Médoc, all of which, of course, are Cru Bourgeois properties, and all of which are from the 2011 vintage. I've given you on your tasting sheet the cépage or the blend, as far as I was able to get that information, as well as the vinification and aging. So you have that information as well, so you don't have to worry about writing that down. So the Médoc itself, and there's a map coming later, you also have, in addition to the tasting sheet, you have a list of the current selection of Cru Bourgeois properties, and on the back of that is a map of Bordeaux. So those are your parting gifts. The Médoc itself is the largest of the Cru Bourgeois area designations, or AOCs. It accounts for about 35% of production in that area. In terms of the type, the wines are all going to be a little bit different, of course, depending on the winemaking style, the slight differences within terroir. But generally, these are wines that are going to be relatively well-structured, robust, full-bodied, and particularly this wine has a lot of, Cabernet Sauvignon in it, so, I think that will translate accordingly. The property itself, Chateau Bornac, has 3 generations of winemaking. The property itself may be older, but in terms of the history I could discern, the winemaking, or at least current present modern winemaking, dates back to 1975 with the Secret family, or Secret family. The grandfather, Pierre Secret, originally established the property in 1975, and today his son, Bruno, and then the grandsons, Bruno's nephews, Guillaume manages the vineyards, and Thibault is responsible for managing the castle. I guess that's director of castle, I guess maybe is his title. So, of course, beautiful. All of the properties you'll see, again, these might not be illustrious properties that we know and think about in terms of, the illustrious Grand Cru Classé properties, but they're, equally beautiful, equally storybook chateau, would fill in nicely for anybody who's doing a remake of Sleeping Beauty, needs a chateau from Central Casting. So, if you haven't gone ahead, please go ahead and taste the wine. The property itself has about just shy of 35 acres. And you'll see with the variety of the wines that we have today, they're mostly mid-sized properties, but you'll see a little bit of difference from property to property. Thoughts on this wine? Like it? Love it? So-so? Nothing? Anyone? Bueller? It's fruity, okay. Yeah, I think there does tend to be, generally with the Cru Bourgeois, there tends to be a little bit more of the, what we expect in terms of old world style. We definitely see, a little bit more fruit forward than perhaps, other wines that, again, these are wines that are meant to be drunk relatively young. So, they're not necessarily going to be so complex, but I think they do still have good structure and do still have some nice secondary components as well. Yes. Okay, so I'm sorry. I apologize. I'm going to keep trying to remember to repeat the questions because they're filming this. So the question was, what generally are the alcohol levels on these wines? I think they tend to be about 13 and a half, but I will just double check. The two that I just briefly looked at were 13, and I'm sure there's a little bit of vintage variation as well as we go, depending on a riper year might be a little bit higher. Okay, so any other comments on this wine? Okay, thank you. We'll move on then. Okay, so so what we've already spoken about in terms of the recognition of this category is that they've been, they have at this point, had been listed among the first earlier reports about Medoc properties. And in the 19th century, we had a slew of books coming out or some sort of publications rather, listing all of the different properties that were in existence. So as early as 1824, we had Mr. Frank's treatise on Bordeaux, which listed 300 Cru Bourgeois properties. And then we had Darmiac's book in 1858, so just a little bit after the 1855 classification, listing 248 properties. What's interesting about at this point is that they started to designate with three different tiers. So you can see we have the Bourgeois Supérieur, Bon Bourgeois, and the Bourgeois Ordinaire. And the breakdown was roughly 34, 64, 150 in terms of that three-tier system. So this is the first time that we're seeing this three-tier hierarchical system within the category. But again, these are just people listing the wines as they existed, and just like with the 1855 classification, most likely based on their pricing. And their pricing did tend to be good pricing in terms of relatively fetching good high prices relative to some other properties and other classifications such as the Cru Artisan. But it wasn't really until 1932 that we see a little bit more of a formal classification. And so in 1932, the Bordeaux wine brokers took action. Of course, this was in the wake of the Great Depression of 1929, and they sought formal recognition for the Cru Bourgeois category as a way to help them financially, of course. So they wanted to gain more official recognition. They registered the classification with the French National Chamber of Commerce and Industry, but what they failed to do was to submit it for ministerial approval. Therefore, we had a official classification At that time, listing 444 properties. And again, we have a 3-tier designation with the term slightly changed. So in this case, Cru Bourgeois supérieur exceptionnel, Cru Bourgeois supérieur, and then simply Cru Bourgeois. And again, of course, a similar kind of breakdown, only 6 at the top level, 92 in that center level, and 346 at the bottom level. And so this was the de facto official classification, official, unofficial, for about 70 years. But over time, additional layers of official aspects of the category occurred. So as a reminder, we're talking about the Médoc, we're talking about the communal properties within the Médoc, and so we're talking about Bordeaux's left bank, and beyond that, the northern part. So Médoc, Haut-Médoc, Listrac, Mouly, and some of the other communes we'll get to, Margaux, Saint-Estèphe, Saint-Julien, and Pauillac. So all of those are entitled to be Cru Bourgeois. So as wonderful as your property might be in the Grave or Pessac-Léognan or in the town of Bourg, which is on the right bank, it is not possible to be Cru Bourgeois unless you're in this specific quadrant of the Bordeaux region. And just as a reminder, again, for people who are less familiar, these are nested appellations. So the regional Bordeaux and Bordeaux Supérieur would be much larger swath of area than the more district Médoc and Haut-Médoc, and then extracting from that Margaux, Listrac, etc. So the next wine is from Châteaumer, and this is from Haut-Médoc. So it's a slightly smaller district commune compared to the Médoc. It accounts for about 28.5% of the production on the upper northern left bank of Bordeaux. These wines tend to be generous and powerful, and with some lively acidity and bright fruit. The property itself was listed in 1876 among the finest wines. Today, the 40-acre estate, so a little bit larger than the previous estate, has nearly all of that acreage planted to vines. And it does have more than 3 centuries of history. They just don't necessarily publicize the history, but it has been around for quite some time. There's a hotel on the property, so they must have a director of chateau as well, but I think that would be a beautiful place to stay for a while. Pretend you are Sleeping Beauty or Prince Charming. The property has been practicing organic agriculture since 2008 and was certified with the 2010 vintage. So the wine you have in your glass is certified organic. Okay. The retail pricing I gave you because I know you all like prices. They're kind of made up prices because most of these wines are not necessarily available in the U.S. So I kind of used Wine Searcher and extrapolated and tried to come up with what it might reasonably be if it was imported into the U.S. Probably they might be a little on the low side because I wasn't sure how to figure in all of the import taxes and things like that. The wines were donated by the Alliance des Cru Bourgeois, for whom I am an ambassador. And so all these wines came directly from France. And so they're intended to showcase the Cru Bourgeois as a category, not necessarily provide you with an opportunity to find a wine that you fall in love with and find again. So I apologize in that respect, but that's where the prices came from. But I know people like to have some gauge. And we'll talk a little bit more about the pricing a little later on. Yes. Okay, the question is, are these estate grapes and do they buy grapes from other vineyards? The answer is these are all estate grapes, and the appellation laws require them to have all estate fruit. The only time they can buy fruit is in emergency times, like if they've lost all of their crop to hail or other Mother Nature gifts, then they can try and find grapes elsewhere. But other than that, they need to be estate-grown grapes. And that is why I don't make wine, because Mother Nature is not always so nice. Thoughts on the Chateau Mare? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you see this one, a different, blend, so, not as heavy on the Cabernet Sauvignon. And that's, obviously a style choice based on what they have in the vineyard and what they've decided to plant. Yes. Sure. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah. So the comment is that the first wine to her palate was a lot stronger, more powerful in terms of the tannins, and wondering about ageability compared to the fact that I just said these are wines that are meant to be drunk young. So yeah, certainly the fact that it's so heavy in Cabernet Sauvignon, so it's much more tannic, and I would agree that this is a wine that we could put down for a while to allow those tannins to soften. I don't want to say that these are not age-worthy wines, but they're wines that, maybe in a good vintage you might want to put down for maybe 5 to 10 years as opposed to having to put them away and forget about them, and compared to other wines that you might do that with. And I think, generally they're still going to be enjoyable young, but we all have, different preferences, and some people will prefer, can deal with stronger tannins earlier on than others in terms of just palate preference. So, yes, David.
Tracy, the list of the Cru Bourgeois producers, does that change? Can someone petition to become a member? Can they get in? What's the process?
Okay, so David is asking, how do people become on the list? And I will get there. So if you could just be a little patient with me, we will get there. I know we're just getting into the 1960s in terms of the history, but when we get into I want to just give you a little more background of where we've been, so then you'll know how we arrived where we are now. So thank you for that question. Okay, so as I said, we are in the 1960s, another time of economic hardship for the Bordelais, and so the owners and producers of the Cru Bourgeois property created a union de Cru Bourgeois de Médoc, as a way of building competitive spirit among them. At that point, in the 1960s, there was only 100 properties that were still in active production making wine at the time. I think, there's probably just not as feasible, financially affordable to produce wine during that time because of the economics. Thankfully, due to their efforts in creating a union and sort of putting a little bit more oomph back into the category, they were mildly successful, and by 1978, there were 124 properties that were functioning as Cru Bourgeois properties, but a far cry from that 444 properties we saw on the list in 1932. So in 1979, the Cru Bourgeois term was actually officially approved by the European Communion Labeling Committee, and that really helped set the stage for further official recognition, because again, we're still dealing with a de facto unofficial classification because it had not been submitted for ministerial approval at that time. But at least at this point, it gave it a little bit more official recognition because it was now approved for labeling. Another note about the wines, obviously you can tell from the glasses that they're all red wines. That was not just a choice, but the Cru Bourgeois wines are only red wines. And in fact, they're only the Grand Vin wines. So when we talk about Cru Bourgeois properties and their wines, the only wine that we're discussing is their Grand Vin wine, not any white wines they might produce, not any other categories if they're making sparkling or rosé, and if they have a second or third wine, those wines are not Cru Bourgeois either. So it's simply their Grand Vin red wine. And of course, just a reminder of the permitted grape varieties. So again, I think there's some wines we're tasting today might have a little bit of Petit Verdot as a little bit of spice in there, but we don't really see Carmenere and Malbec, even though they still are permitted. Okay, so the third wine is Chateau Semillon Mazot, and this is from a much smaller commune from Listrac. And Listrac really only accounts for about 4%. It is quite geographically tiny. It's known as the roof of the Medoc, and for the reason for that is because of the elevation. It's a slightly higher elevation than the surrounding areas in the Medoc and Haut-Medoc area, and because of that slight elevation, it helps to reduce problems with rot. Of course, mold and mildew are wonderful partners in a maritime climate. And it does have very good drainage with the soils that exist there. The wines tend to have a lot of spice, be very balanced, with a little bit of fleshy fruit, and some rich and berry fruit. The property itself was originally owned by the Viscountess de Pavillon throughout the 1900s, and it was known at that time as Chateau Semillon. But she sold the property to Sir Holstein in 1925. In 1938, Sir Holstein divided the property among his 3 daughters, and this particular property that exists today was divided to the daughter who had married Monsieur Mazot, hence the appended name Semillon Mazot. In 1995, the property was sold to the Jander family from Berlin, and they built a new barrel cellar in 1998. It's another property that's organic, and they've been organic since 2012. The property does date back to quite some time, and it was mentioned in the literature as a wine-producing property in 1876 as well. Thoughts on the third wine? I see heads nodding. I'm assuming heads nodding means you like it. They're nodding this way, so I'm assuming. Yeah, I think this one, again, the tannins are a little more present than the previous wine, even though it doesn't have quite the same Cabernet content, but I think maybe we're picking up maybe some of the barrel tannins as well. Okay, so that goes back to David's question. So he wants to know what's really the difference between the Grand Cru Classé wines that some of you enjoyed with Paul compared to what these Cru Bourgeois wines are. Are they second wines? Are they next door? Which is a great question. I'm going to make sure I answer that, but I think as we finish up with the history, we're going to get there. What I do want to mention now, and to follow up on Harvey's comment, is that I don't know the prices of the wines that Paul poured, but I suspect they were a lot higher prices than the prices that I've been able to tease out for you with these wines. I'm going to read a quote that I was going to read a little bit later, but because you made the segue now, I think it's relevant at this point. So Roger Bomrich, who is a master of wine, wrote an article in Wine Business Monthly in January of this year. The article was called Bordeaux, an iconic region battles to sustain market share. And this quote struck me, and this is what he wrote. The Wine Market Council has shown that the most influential factor determining the purchase decisions of American consumers is an exceptional price-to-value relationship. He goes on to say, this is precisely the Achilles heel of Bordeaux. Now, I would argue, and of course your palates will be your own judges, but that the Cru Bourgeois category very explicitly negates that comment, because the wines generally fall between $20 to $50 US prices, with an average price of $25. I do think that you will see good price to value quality here. That doesn't mean you're going to love every wine, but if you're finding that your blind tasting wise, you think you will find wines that you will like at equal price points, I think that answers my question in that respect. What they are, yes, there is a lot of adjacency. The wine that we're going to have last is from Margaux. It is pretty much adjacent to Chateau Margaux, but it is, of course, not Chateau Margaux. It is Chateau Pontac Lynch. So these are wines that are there's a lot of proximity with the Cru Bourgeois properties to Grand Cru Class A properties, and they are not second wines. They are their own properties. How they are assessed today, we're going to get to in just a few more slides, so just a little more patience. Yes? Okay, so can I have a volunteer remedy that problem? Thank you very much, and we will solve that. Okay, so we're getting closer to an official classification because remember, as far back as the Middle Ages, this has been de facto unofficial. 1932 was official but not official. And so in 2000, they finally set the rules for an official Cru Bourgeois classification. They set up a whole series of criteria ranging from reputation, price, terroir, winemaking practices, viticultural practices, blind tasting. They needed to submit their wines from 1994 until 1999, getting ready for a new classification to supersede what had been existing since 1932. And that was, these criteria were established by the French National Ministerial Order. So in 2003, I'm sorry, was there a question? That was just for labeling purposes within the EU. That was just in terms of using that term on the labels. The question was, what was the difference between 1979 and what was going on in 2000 and now into 2003? In 1979, that was official recognition by the European Union in terms of using the word Cru Bourgeois on the label. So with this new set of criteria, the new classification for Cru Bourgeois du Médoc was introduced in 2003. They had 490 properties submit their wines under those 9 criteria. 247 of them received Cru Bourgeois status, and which is pretty similar of figure to what we saw when we had the 1858 publication by Darmillac. So, not too far off in terms of that. Now, what happened was we have, again, a 3-tier system with Cru Bourgeois Exceptionnel. There were 9 chateaux that were designated at that top level, 87 properties as Cru Bourgeois Supérieur, and 151 that were simply Cru Bourgeois. The intention was to have a classification that would be renewed every 10 years, very similarly to what we see or saw at the time in Saint-Emilion. And this was finally the official classification. But of course, what happens when you have about half of the applicants denied? You have a lot of angry people. And what do modern angry people do? They sue, exactly. So, as you might recall, this was a classification that was on again, off again, on again. If you were trying to do a presentation, update a wine book, just be well informed, it was really challenging to know what was going on and what was the true status of the Cru Bourgeois. At the same time, Saint-Emilion had its own similar problems when it revealed the 2006 classification, so you could just have fun following the court cases between the two classifications. What eventually happened in 2007 was that the Administrative Court of Appeals of Bordeaux annulled the classification. The reason for the nullification was that the president of the Cru Bourgeois du Médoc Union was on the tasting panel. and the court found that he had, not surprisingly, a vested interest and therefore was not an impartial party as a member of that evaluation. To add insult to injury, the French Fraud Office decided to ban the term Cru Bourgeois altogether. So there was no Cru Bourgeois system. And around this time, Frederic de la Mothe had recently come on board to the Cru Bourgeois. So, we all have problems when you start a new job. Where's the restroom? What forms do I need to fill out? Her problem was the entire reason for her existence no longer existed. But so what happened? And this answers finally David's question. Well, we're going to taste the wine first, then we're going to answer David's question. So this is the Chateau Palmis. It's from another tiny appellation or commune called Mouly. Usually Mouly and Lichac are often linked together when you're studying at least. So it's similarly tiny, about 4% of the production in that area. The wines generally have complex aromas, are elegant with mellow tannins, and it's equidistant between the river and the Lalande forest, so it's slightly less maritime than some of the other areas, but not really enough to say it's continental. This property is just over 20 acres. It does go back to the 50s, the 1450s, and belonged to Chevalier de Lille, who defended the troops of Charles VII. From 1826 to 2008, it was owned by the Baron family and was sold to Patrick Ménard in 2008. So thoughts on the Chateau Palmis? Fruity, well balanced. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm getting more feedback on this one. So either your tongues are loosened with the wine, or maybe this one is more of a crowd favorite. Yeah. Okay, so after 2007, they realized they had to go back to the drawing board. And so what that drawing board entailed was to completely scrap the original Cru Bourgeois category as a hierarchical property selection, and instead they created a brand new concept. It is an annual assessment of quality. And so in 2009, they unveiled the new system, the new concept. So it is no longer a classification per se. What it is that every year, properties that are within the Médoc, those communes that I've already mentioned, that wish to apply for Cru Bourgeois status may submit their wines 2 years after the vintage for consideration. And so there's an eligibility visit that takes place, and the wines are blind tasted against a benchmark. So they have learned their lesson. So most importantly, they've hired a third party called the Bureau Veritas, who undertakes all of this process to make sure that we don't have any vested interest or partial parties making the decision. They taste the wines, create a benchmark, which is indicative of that particular vintage, and then taste the wines from all of the applicants to determine whether or not they either meet or exceed that benchmark. If they meet or exceed the benchmark, they are granted Cru Bourgeois status. If not, they do not get Cru Bourgeois status. So the wines that you're tasting today are the 2011 vintage, and these wines were Cru Bourgeois for the 2011 vintage. So again, this is only the Grand Vin wines for these properties, and it's very different from all the other classifications in that it's truly the wine that is being judged. So the Chateau is not being judged specifically, and maintaining this Cru Bourgeois status anymore. It's simply every year that they wish to be designated as Cru Bourgeois, they must submit their wines for evaluation under the process. Yes?
How do they choose the standard wine?
What they do is they taste, I think they taste all of the wines, or a selection. I don't I didn't quite understand all of the ramifications, detail, but they taste a broad section of the wines and create a benchmark score based on that selection. And therefore, then they can go and taste your chateau's wines and say, yes, your wines meet that score or exceed that score, and taste your wines and say yes or no similarly. So that's how it's done. No. These wines are, the question is it possible to have more than one classification? So the answer is no. These are wines that are simply being submitted by properties that would be permitted to be Cru Bourgeois by the fact that they're creating red wines within the designated communes. As I said, if you might be a wonderful producer in Pessac-Léognan or a wonderful producer in the Grave, but you are not entitled to submit your wines. You might be a wonderful producer on the right bank. Again, you may not submit your wines. Does that answer the question? Okay. Yes, question. So I don't have those figures per se. I do have a slide that shows the growth in the number of wines that are designated as Cru Bourgeois. I suspect that we're seeing a growth, not that they're necessarily being more generous in the number of wines that they designate as Cru Bourgeois, but that we're seeing more properties that see the value of the Cru Bourgeois designation and therefore are willing to submit their wines. It does represent about 30% of production in the Médoc area. But I don't have the figures in terms of how many wines are not designated Cru Bourgeois, so I apologize for that. If I can get that information, I will share it with AWS and allow them to disseminate it. Yes, David?
And the ones that don't get accepted become Cru Artisan?
No, they don't. They would simply be Bordeaux or Bordeaux Supérieur, or they could still be a Listrac or a Mouly designation. They just are not Cru Bourgeois. There's really no other place for them. I mean, they can submit their wines to the AWS and they could maybe be double gold if they're good. But there's no other opportunity for that kind of a designation. When you are finding these wines in the market, whether on-premise or off-premise, what they've done as of the 2010 vintage is to create this sticker. The sticker is not just to have jewelry on the wine, but to offer two aspects. The first is information. You'll notice that there is a QR code on the sticker, and so anyone with a QR code reader can scan it and get information on the wine and the chateau. And you'll also notice that it's a fairly attractive holographic kind of label, and that's intentional so that it cannot, of course, be easily duplicated. What that means for you as a consumer is that anyone bearing this necklace is definitely Cru Bourgeois, and similarly, the chateau only receive enough labels based on what they've declared is their appropriate volume of production. So if they run out if they sell all of their Cru Bourgeois wine, for example, they can't now take this label and put it on their second wine or anything else. So it is a information tool as well as a guarantee of authenticity and quality. Yes? Correct. The question is, but to be a Cru Bourgeois, you must be within the Médoc region in one of the either district or communal AOCs. Yes. Is that? Okay, I just wanted to make sure that if there wasn't a follow-up to that. Okay. Okay, so we have another wine to taste. So this is Chateau Pontac Lynch. The property is in Margaux, as I mentioned. Margaux is the largest of the communal areas. It's at 8.5%, so it's still relatively tiny, but larger, twice as large as Listrac or Mouly. These are wines, generally when we think about Margaux, we think about feminine wines, whatever that means. Whereas, we don't have a Pauillac to taste today, but Pauillac wines are often referred to as more masculine. Whether if that means anything, great. If not, we'll move on to other characteristics. generally complex aromas, maybe some more red fruit, raspberry, cherry, red currant. Again, you may not find that in all Margaux wines, but this is, if you look up in a textbook, Margaux wines, what you'll find. As we were discussing, these are wines, the Cru Bourgeois wines are wines that have a lot of adjacency to top properties, and certainly Margaux, as we said, is home to Chateau Margaux, which is one of the top Grand Cru Class A properties, and also as well as other Cru Bourgeois properties. So a lot of close proximity, similar terroir, and thankfully in this case, much lower price point. In 1720, Count Lynch built the present house as a hunting lodge, because of course we all need a hunting lodge. And then eventually it became the property of Monsieur Pontac, hence the appended name of Pontac Lynch. It's 20 acres, so a little smaller than some of the other properties that we saw. In 1952, the property was purchased by a family from Burgundy, Jean-Pierre Bondin, and currently his daughter, Marie Christina, manages the vineyard. And as I said, this is right next door to Chateau Margaux. Thoughts on the Pontac Lynch? Nice oak, okay. Okay, nice oak, well balanced, very drinkable, good structure. Yeah, again, as I said, a lot of these wines are meant to be drunk young, but I think, you certainly don't have to be in a rush to drink them. Particularly, I have a vintage rating chart coming up in a slide or two, but 2011 was considered not the most top vintage, but certainly a good vintage. Yes, Reed. There's a wide range, and I noticed when I was, putting, if I recall correctly, and I didn't review prior to today's presentation, but if I recall correctly, yields are about 55 hectares per hectoliter for Bordeaux Superior. But I honestly have not. I don't have that in front of me to be fair. But so these are a little bit lower in most cases. But you'll see, we have a range. So for example, some of these are 40. The first wine, the Bornac, was 35. Yes. Oh, okay. I think these are fairly in line, depending. I think the question is, how do these yields compare to the Grand Cru Class A wines? I think the wines, particularly the wines that are in the 35 to 40 hectoliters per hectare yields, are fairly in line with the Grand Cru Class A properties. The ones that are maybe a little bit on the higher side, maybe a little bit more akin in terms of the yields to Bordeaux and Bordeaux Superior. Some of that, might be vintage related, and some of it just might be viticultural philosophy. Thank you. So as I said when the gentleman asked earlier, there is a little bit of growth. So when they first announced the new system or process with the 2008 vintage, there were 243 properties that were designated. The most recent selection was announced in September of this year, and that's the 2012 vintage, and that's the list that you have. Even though you're tasting the 2011, you'll see I did highlight in red all of the chateaux you're tasting today, so they all were they all were successful in the next most recent selection. So there's, it's not a huge increase, but again, there's a slight increase, and I attribute that to the work that the Cru Bourgeois is doing in promoting the category and allowing these properties to see that. I'm sure there's a fee involved in all of that in terms of applying, and so they're seeing that is money well spent in terms of having the designation, being able to have the label on the wine, both in terms of the new black QR code label as well as the word Cru Bourgeois on the label. Yes. No, that was your neighbor's question. The question is how many wineries are submitting their wines for consideration compared to the number of wines that are actually achieving Cru Bourgeois status. I don't have that figure. I will try and get that figure and get that disseminated to the AWS, but I don't have that information at the moment. So, thank you. The question is, does weather play a part in that as well? Certainly, weather vintage variation is going to impact the wines, and certainly, there is the thought that better winemakers can produce great wine regardless of what Mother Nature throws at them. And if you're not such a great winemaker, you find it more challenging when Mother Nature is more challenging. But as I said, with this selection process, they do the benchmark wine tasting selection does take vintage variation into account, so they're not expecting wines of vintage X to taste exactly like wines of vintage Y. So, if there's that vintage variation should not be reflected in these numbers per se. Okay, so we're gonna have the last wine of the session, not the last wine of the day, of course. So this is the Chateau Lillian-la-Douce. This is from Saint-Estèphe, which accounts for about 7.5% of Médoc production. Wines are generally refined and elegant with vanilla and spice. Now, this is the largest of the properties we're tasting from today. It's 115 acres, so considerably larger. The next largest was about 40 acres, so much, much larger estate. This estate, again, another newcomer, from 1564. But even though it had a wonderful reputation for quite some time, it lost some of its luster back in probably the early part of the 20th century. But in 1989, its new owner, Christian Tableau, purchased it, renovated the property, and at the time it was simply Chateau La Douce. But he decided to rename the property in honor and recognition of his wife, Lillian. We should all be so fortunate to have our spouse purchase a chateau and rename it after us. But in any case, the property was sold again in 2008 and is currently owned by Françoise and Jackie Lorenzetti. And they really are, again, focused on restoring the property to its former glory and are condensing the estate to the best parcels. So, that 115 acres, we may see a reduction in that in terms of what's being produced. Okay, so some thoughts on the Lillian-la-Douce. Yes, Rosemary. Well, so the question from Rosemary is that a lot of these are more heavily weighted in terms of the blend toward Merlot. And she was asking, given that this is left bank Bordeaux, why are they so heavily Merlot? First of all, as you may know, Merlot is the most widely planted grape variety in Bordeaux. And it just is an easier grape to grow. So a lot of these properties probably just have more Merlot planted on their estate. There's no requirement to be more heavily Cabernet focused with your wines when you're left bank Bordeaux. That's not part of the appellation. What we do see that with the Grand Cru Class A wines, they do tend to be more heavily Cabernet Sauvignon, but I think partially they have the much more higher resources to be able to cultivate the Cabernet Sauvignon, which I think requires a lot more time and effort to do well, given the climate and all of that. But that's why I was a little surprised to see from a Médoc appellation that first wine being so heavily Cabernet Sauvignon. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was saying that the acidity is very striking on this wine. Mm-hmm. The comment was that it coats your mouth more. other comments, questions? Okay. So just very briefly, as a reminder, Bordeaux doesn't have bad vintages anymore. It just has better vintages and good and fabulous vintages. So 2011, it's not necessarily one that they could, reasonably herald as the vintage of the century again, but but it's considered a good vintage. 2010 and 2009, a little bit, better, but, of course, it's also different. So I know particularly with the 2009 and the 2010, they're just very different in terms of style because one was a riper vintage than the other. So it's more just a, decision about what you prefer and what you don't prefer. And again, as I said, these are wines that you can age, particularly in the better vintages, but you don't have to take that time and effort if you don't want to. You can buy them right off the list or right from the store and enjoy them that evening. So, just as we're wrapping up, I just have a few images of Bordeaux. I am a Bordeaux Cru Bourgeois ambassador. I also had the wonderful opportunity to visit Bordeaux in 2013, and I had not been to Bordeaux since 1999, and I was pleasantly surprised by the changes. So, of course, Bordeaux still has its wonderful history, and you definitely feel that. A lot of the buildings are very historic. Here's evidence of that limestone bedrock. So a lot of the buildings, particularly built in the 1800s, do reflect that. And then we're seeing, just some more liveliness of people out on the streets. The current mayor, Mr. Juppé, has put in a lot of time and effort to clean up the city, get rid of a lot of the crime, and put in a lot of services that didn't exist before. I talked about how Bordeaux is important for this category as a city of commerce. This is right near the river, the bridge, and this is the Place de la Bourse, where the Chamber of Commerce and other economic institutions are existing. Again, merchant class, very reflective of what the wines we were tasting today, the same area just by day. Certainly ancient monuments, or not necessarily ancient, but certainly historic monuments, and now joined by more modern monorails, making it a lot easier to get around the city. The old architecture juxtaposed with modern sculptures. Of course, wine always taking center stage. Certainly the modern aspect of the systems. But what we're also seeing, what's interesting, is going to some of the wine bars. Of course, mostly Bordeaux wines, opportunity at like Max Bordeaux, for example, to taste Grand Cru Classé wines, in a little tiny pour. But even in this particular bistro, Quatre Coins, they are serving not only wines from outside of Bordeaux, but blasphemy, wines from outside of France. So it's just nice to see that modernity coming in. And of course, plenty of gastronomy. So of course, everything to clog your arteries, foie gras and meats. And the quenelles, which are an egg yolk-based pastry, very reflective of the wine culture of Bordeaux because, as you may know, they use egg whites in the fining of wine rather. And back in the day, they had all these extra egg yolks. What were they going to do with them? Well, the pastry chef said, we'll take them off your hands, and created the quenelle egg yolk-based pastry. Now, today, they still do make this pastry. They do not get the egg yolks from the winery. I don't think the health department finds that too sanitary anymore. They get their own fresh eggs. But it is still a very big part of the culture and indicative of how the wine culture flows throughout Bordeaux, regardless of whether we're talking about wine or gastronomy. So I thank you for sticking with me the end of the day, and so much for your attention as well. So thank you.